So you can see the title there, Thomas Hamilton, the most important person in Chermside's history. Now that's an inflammatory title. Lots of you have ancestors who lived in Chermside a long time ago, and you probably think that your ancestors were the most important people in Chermside. You're wrong. And I'm going to tell you why. However, I wasn't being inflammatory just for the sake of it. I wanted to make a point. And I can't really talk about the entirety of the Hamilton history in half an hour, so I'm going to subtitle this talk thus: The Past, Present and Future of Thomas Hamilton's Diaries, because he wrote a lot of them, and we're going to talk about them later. I'm going to talk about 4 different things. Firstly, I'm going to talk about Thomas Hamilton's life. I'm going to talk about his diaries. I'm going to talk about the Historical Society's connection with his diaries, and then I'm going to talk about my connection with the diaries, which is the future applications of the diaries. And here's a picture of the man himself. You'll notice it is a horrible quality photo, and that's for 2 reasons. Firstly, it's very old. It's about 100 years old. Secondly, Thomas Hamilton, as far as I'm aware, very rarely posed for photographs by himself. We've got a photograph of him in this room, actually, right in that corner, as part of the Kedron War Repatriation Committee. He's with 100 other people. You rarely get him by himself, but there he is, with his tools, hard at work. Now, I said that I was divisive and inflammatory in my title, but I'm going to try and win you round by giving you an example. And it's not of Thomas Hamilton. It is of this man, Samuel Pepys. Who's heard of Samuel Pepys? Put your hand up if you've heard of him. Excellent. And we're going to contrast him with his exact contemporary, George Carteret. Who's heard of him? George Carteret.
I only know the other ones, that's it.
Okay. They were exact contemporaries, and yet a whole heap of you have heard of one of them and not of the other. Of course, a sample size of one room of history buffs isn't very scientific. So what could I use to compare and contrast these 2 people who were contemporaries in another way? And we've got this. It's a nice little graph. And it's actually the views of these people's pages on Wikipedia. Have you all heard of Wikipedia? Yeah. Excellent. The green line is Samuel Pepys. The blue line is George Carteret. Samuel Pepys is 16 times more popular. But in their day, Carteret was the more famous person. Why then does Samuel Pepys have relevance to people today that they want to view him on Wikipedia? Why is he important to people nowadays more so than George Carteret? And the reason that he has relevance value is that during the 1660s, Samuel Pepys wrote his thoughts down and his actions down in a diary of 1 million words. So the reason that Thomas Hamilton is Chermside's most important person in history is that he wrote diaries for 61 years. Thomas Hamilton is Chermside's Samuel Pepys. I'm not the only one interested in the Hamilton family. Of course, the Hamilton family are interested in the Hamilton family, but other people are as well. In 1988, Muriel Scott, who I later found out was actually a granddaughter of Thomas Hamilton, wrote a biography of the family, and we have a copy of it here. And in 2001, our very own Beverly Isdale wrote a biography of the family, and I'll be relying on these 2 sources for the information on Thomas Hamilton's life, which I'll give to you right now. He was born on the 17th of February 1860 in Liverpool, England. His early life, like so many others in the 19th century, was filled up with death and disease. He saw the deaths of several of his siblings to disease, and one who at the age of 15 fell into a quarry pit and died. And so his parents decided to emigrate to Australia, and they sailed on the Ocean Princess on the 10th of August 1866. And they arrived in Brisbane on the 28th of December 1866, a journey of 140 days. Almost exactly 125 years later, I travelled from my hometown in England to Australia. It was in 1991 and the first Gulf War was going on, and so we couldn't fly through the Middle East. We had to fly over Russia. Wouldn't recommend that nowadays, but that's what we did. It took 25 hours, which was considered an exceptionally long flight. Come a long way in 125 years. The Hamilton connection to Chermside, or Downfall Creek as it was back then, started on the 27th of September 1869, when Thomas's father, Andrew Hamilton, bought 20 acres, which was portion 571. He bought it from Thomas Beard, who was the first person to actually purchase the land from the Queensland government. At this time, they were living in Spring Hill, the Hamilton family, and they travelled out to Downfall Creek to inspect the property. And I've heard people at this society talk about Chermside being bushland in the 1950s. Well, in the 1860s, it really was bushland, so much so that they had trouble finding the exact boundaries where the property was. They travelled from Spring Hill to Downfall Creek, inspected the property, found the boundaries, went back to Spring Hill, and that took all day for that round trip of 20 kilometres. Of course, back then, Downfall Creek was a very small place. It had a population of about 100 people. Nowadays, the Chermside area has over 10,000 people, and this is that same portion in blue there. And you can see Bernie Bray Park, and I'll talk about that a bit later. So they moved out there in 1869 when Thomas was 9 years old. 4 years later, Thomas's father, Andrew, started work on Bernie Bray, the building. And that very same year, at the age of 13, Thomas started work for his father in the carpentry business. Now, throughout Thomas's life, he had many jobs, often running simultaneously. He was very much the modern person in terms of working for themselves, where you have a portfolio career rather than working for one company. He worked often simultaneously for himself as a sole trader, for his family business, and for external contractors. And you'll see that in his diary. One day he's working for one person, another day he's cleaning his tools for himself, another day he's working for himself, another day he's working for someone else, anyone who will give him money. He did what he needed to survive, and he did that for many, many years. In 1884, so in his early 20s, he selected 160 acres at Woombai. And you can see his land right there. And he selected that because it was right across the creek from the McClintocks, who were his cousins. Now, one thing that Queensland had very early in its history was no money, but lots of land. And so what they did, if you want a copy of that, I've actually got a digital copy that I can give to you later. What they did is they got people, they said, we'll give you this land, but you can't sell it until you've improved it to a measurable degree. And that took Thomas Hamilton 6 years to improve it to a measurable degree. And it's a sign of how much he wanted to come back to Downfall Creek, that as soon as he fulfilled those conditions, he was straight back home to Downfall Creek. However, he always kept a soft spot in his heart for Woombai. In the middle of those 6 years, in 1887, he married his cousin, Margaret Jane Hamilton. Now, you might go, well, there weren't many Queenslanders around that time. There are enough not to have to marry your cousin. But he did anyway. Her maiden name was Hamilton, her married name was Hamilton. It made things a lot easier. What was not easy was her name. She was known as MJ, and the reason for that is it seems like every second person in the Hamilton family seemed to be named Charlotte, James, Margaret, or Thomas. And you'll see that later. You're not any of those, are you? Are you a Charlotte, a Jane, a Thomas? No, good. Good thing for you. In 1889, just before they moved back to Downfall Creek, they had their first child. And they came back to Downfall Creek for her birth. And then in 1890, straight after they moved back, he was born. We'll talk a bit more about that. Then Eddie, his real name was Thomas, but you can see why he was known as Eddie. Then Clara, Rebecca, Alex, and William, for some reason known as Hector. If you know why, I'd love to know, but they should have just called him Hector, I think. In 1897, Andrew died at the age of 71, and so Thomas took over the coach building business. And Downfall Creek was expanding quite rapidly at that time, and Andrew had been smart and bought lots of land in the area. Thomas and MJ owned a lot of land around Brisbane in their own right, but the land that he inherited from his father was shared with his siblings after 1915 when his mother died. So his father died in 1897, his mother died in 1915, and then the land was all his and his siblings to divide up into estates, which they did. Now you can tell that this estate, whoops, gone one too far. You can tell that this estate predates 1897, so Chermside was being subdivided into housing estates much sooner than people think, because it's got Andrew's name on it, so that was obviously printed before 1897. And you can see from this local sketch, it's quite dodgy, because if you look at the land for sale, they've placed it exactly halfway between Kedron Brook and Downfall Creek. So in other words, making it appear a lot closer to Brisbane than it actually was. It's just over there, that land. That's way closer to Downfall Creek than it is to Kedron Brook. So there are some tricks that are, well, it's not just modern advertisers who are a bit scheming. Anyway, they were still subdividing and selling off land in estates in Chermside up to the late 1930s. As well as being part of the family blacksmith and coach building business, he had a lot to do with his community. And this is a non-exhaustive list. This is as much as I could fit on the page. Is that big enough for you all to see? Yeah, good. So all of those, apart from Kedron Shire Councillor, were unpaid. So earlier I said that Thomas Hamilton was the Samuel Pepys of Chermside. Maybe it's a bit more accurate to say that Thomas Hamilton was the Beverly Isdale of early Chermside. And I mentioned earlier the photo in the corner, that was the Repatriation Committee. I think I've put that up on there. There it is, that one. So you can see all the other people on that committee there. However, there was a bit of upheaval to come. You see, blacksmiths did mainly work for horses, and coach building was mainly for horse and buggies. And by 1913, people were starting to own motor cars. In fact, the very first person to own a motor car in Chermside, William Early, died when it rode over him. And that was 1903, I believe, or 1909. So by 1913, the motor car was already causing havoc in Chermside. And so what was he to do? In 1913, he decided to sell the family business to the Chermside Engineering and Manufacturing Company, but he stayed on as a director, so they obviously thought highly of him. They didn't just bite off him and get rid of him. The entire company was sold later to Thomas's son Hugh, and Thomas stayed on as a worker for his son. He had no sense of shame for working for someone else. He had no sense of shame for working for his family. Work was important to him, and that's what he did. By the way, another reason I put all these up on the screen is not only was he a part of them, he wrote about them in his diaries. So we know all about all these different groups. That's why he's important. As I said earlier, in 1915 his mother died, so he was now an orphan, even though he was in his 50s. But that meant that Bernie Bray was available. And so after a few years after that, he moved in 1917 with MJ, and they stayed there until 1932, so when he was in his early 70s. When he moved out of Bernie Bray, I think one of his children lived there afterwards. He lived with various friends and relatives, moved around a bit before MJ and Thomas acquired a property in Rhodey Road, and MJ died on the 21st of October 1938 in her 70s, and Thomas on the 7th of October 1951 at the age of 91. And if you saw the family tree before, I'll just flick back to that. Oh, there it is. That's an average age of his children in the 80s. And for 7 children born in the 19th century, they did exceptionally well. When you consider that at the turn of the century, the average life expectancy was 40. So they did exceptionally well for themselves. Okay, where are we? 1 year after Thomas died, Bernie Bray was demolished in 1952. This was 4 years after the Queensland government acquired compulsorily the property to build social housing. Nowadays, a lot of the land is used for the Bernie Bray Park, and the Senior Citizens Centre next door is also named Bernie Bray. The park was renamed in the 1990s at the instigation of Thomas Hamilton's granddaughter, Joan Hamilton, who quite a few of you would have known. We'll talk about her a bit later. Now, so that's Thomas Hamilton. Let's talk about the diaries. Thomas Hamilton wrote his first entry on January the 1st, 1890, shortly before he moved from Woombye to Downfall Creek. And he wrote his last entry on the 2nd of October 1951, 5 days before he died. So you really get a wide range of life there. After he stopped writing, so in the 5 days before his death, one of his children actually filled in the entries until he actually died, which was very good of them. Obviously, someone thought it should be kept for posterity. Many of the early years are missing. If we look at the 1890s and the 1900s, all we have is 1890, 1894, 1898, 1900, big gap, and then everything from 1910 all the way up to 1951. He wrote in a simple, matter-of-fact style, and I'll give some examples of that later. There is very little sentimentalism in his writing, and we'll see that later. Now, this is an example of what the diaries look like. But, luckily for you, thanks to, sorry, I've forgotten your name. Helen. We actually have the actual diaries, some of them, here in a nice horse-nail box with some horseshoes. So, come and speak to Helen later. I'm not going to show them to you because I don't want to touch them with my hands. I don't want to destroy them. They're too valuable for that. Speak to Helen about that. They're contained in books with pre-written dates. Now, these type of diaries were widely available until about 15 years ago when everyone started putting their calendars on their phone. But I'm sure some of you still have this type of diary. The CDHS involvement with these diaries came through Joan Hamilton, Thomas's granddaughter, and she was a foundation member here at CDHS. She was born in 1924, so she knew Thomas Hamilton until he died when she was in her late 20s, and she's actually mentioned in the diaries. And she died in 2015, so I knew her for 3 years. She was the last Hamilton in Chermside, and she was an energetic defender and preserver and promoter of Hamilton history. After all, she got Bernie Brae Park renamed. It was previously named Annan Park after Frederick Anand, who was a town clerk for Brisbane City Council. She got him booted, and he got a park in Chermside West instead. So yeah, she was not a woman you wanted to go up against. At her request, Beverley wrote the family history of the Hamilton family. So next one. This is a picture from 2006, and a few of you would recognise these faces. We've got Peggy Endress on the right. We've got Carol Cunningham in the middle, and we've got Margaret Argo on the left, and behind the camera we have Beverley Isdale, because of course Beverley is part of everything to do with Chermside Districts Historical Society. And in 2006, between them, they photographed 46 volumes of the diary that are still existent, and that's about 4,800 pages. And they did it through this box. You put the diary underneath, put the camera on top, because of course no one had a camera on their phone back then. It was a digital camera, but it was an actual camera rather than a phone. Lens went through there, click the button, turn the page, repeat 4,800 times. Every week for a whole year, wasn't it, Bev? Those 4,800 images were printed. We have a copy in our archive room. There was also a second printed copy presented to the Hamilton family in 2006. Are you part of this photo? You are, where are you?
Oh, yeah,
Left. There you go. And that's Joan Hamilton at the back. So they got a printed copy. They also got a digital copy. It was backed up on our computer system. I've got a copy at my house. I believe Bev's got a copy at her house. It was also presented to the Hamiltons in this, a portfolio of 46 CDs, because people used CDs back then. This was presented to Joan. It ended up back at CDHS. I believe that was because Joan left it to us after she died. However, it's just a digital copy. We've got plenty of others. A third digital copy used to be on our website before we revamped it, and this is what it looked like. So I gave examples of the various years, showed what I've just shown you, the picture of people taking photos of it. And it's an indication of the importance that Pat O'Shea, when he put this on the website, he thought it was important because of all the hundreds of pages that he put on the website. This was the 13th one, and you can see up on the top, it was right up the top. He thought it was important, so do I. Now, if we go back, you'll notice that Peggy is typing on a computer, and that's because she transcribed certain sections of the diary so that we could put them on our website and so that people could actually read a few days of certain years. Unfortunately, Peggy decided to move off to Bribie Island, so she stopped transcribing. And we had some volunteers from the State Library of Queensland, but we didn't hear anything past 2010. And so everything seems to stop. until the early 2020s when I decided to tackle them, and this is the future of the Hamilton Diaries. Now, these diaries appealed to me for a few reasons. I had quite the affinity with Thomas Hamilton. He sounded like someone who was quite a lot like me. He was a very black and white person. He told people exactly what he thought of them, very much like me. And he believed in the power of hard work and just getting things done. Another thing that I only noticed at the beginning of this year is, if you looked at his family tree, he had 2 children called Clara and Alex. My 2 children called Clara and Alex. Just go figure, that was pure coincidence. The second reason I liked tackling these diaries is it was a very finite task. Thomas Hamilton isn't going to be writing any more diaries. Once they're written out, they're written out. So, I thought, yep, I can manage that. Let's go. So first I had to plan the layout, and I didn't want to just transcribe the diaries because that's boring. Who wants to just read about one person's thoughts? It might have worked for Samuel Pepys, maybe. Even his diaries have commentary in certain editions. So I wanted to talk about other stuff. I wanted to juxtapose what he was writing with other events of the day, from papers, from Trove, from government gazettes, from whatever I could grab my hands on. And I also wanted to print it out. I didn't want it just to exist digitally. So I had page limits to think about. And so I couldn't do all the 61 years, or 46 years that exist. I couldn't do them all in one go. So I decided to break them up. And an obvious break was right here, these disparate years here. So they're ones I'm calling the colonial years, and I've already transcribed those. Next ones I'll do are the pre-war years, 1910 to 1913, and then I'll talk about other ones once I've got finished. Obviously we'll have the final years, which is the ones when he dies. But I want to get the first one finished before I think about going on too far. With the limits of the first book set, the 4 years, I got set transcribing them, and I wanted to make life as easy as possible for myself, so I'm going to show you how I did that. First thing is my setup. Now, ignore this computer, it's not important. But what I've got is one computer with 2 monitors, and on the left, I had the actual image of his diary, the handwritten stuff. On the right, I had what I was doing to write it out, typing it out, and seeing if I'd made any mistakes. But I didn't use a word processor like most people would. Reason is, word processors look rubbish. You compare something printed with Microsoft Word with something coming out of a book, and you know which one's the book and which one's Microsoft Word. So I use a package called LaTeX, which is, you can see Mark nodding his head there. It's designed specifically for dissertations, books, articles, anywhere where you want a really high level of output. And the design is included. I just tell it what I want it to do, press the little green button in the top left, and off it goes. So I get to define what the chapter is. I get to define text IT as italic. Anything between those red brackets is going to be italic. I've got some subsections here with January 1st, 2nd and 3rd. And if I want a footnote, I just write /footnote, and anything between that bracket and the next one will be a footnote. And it makes everything really easy. You've got to learn how to use it in the first place, but when you press play, you get something really nice. Remembering this is a screenshot, and this doesn't look nearly as good as it gets printed. So you've got your chapter title, you've got your italics, you've got your subsections, and you've got your footnotes. And that's just a little bit of what you can do with the LaTeX program. So that's great. So far, so good. However, things are never as easy as you think they're going to be, and I've got a knowing grin from Julia because she's done this kind of thing before. The first issue is missing sections. There are some pages that are ripped, so you're never going to get that page back. I think I know Thomas Hamilton pretty well, having read his thoughts for 4 different years, but no, I'm not that good. The second issue is that of legibility, and you'll see this later. I'm going to show you some actual examples, and I'm going to read what he's written, and you can see if you can follow along. When I started transcribing these, every second or third word, I didn't know what was going on. However, now I can work out a lot of it through context. If he says, I'm going to Bla's store, if it's a Sunday, I know pretty much where he's going on that Sunday. Well, on Sunday he was going to church. So he wouldn't be going to anyone's store on Sunday, that was a bad example. But I can work out a lot of it through context alone. The third issue is that of names. Now, not only was every second person called Margaret, James, Thomas, or whatever the other one was, he often just abbreviated people to letters, and you don't know how difficult that is to work out. No amount of context is going to help you there. Now, you might have noticed that when I was talking about the diary and I presented you a page of that, it was pretty much the word-for-word stuff. Now, I told you I didn't want to just do that. So, I'll tell you why. It's not for lack of information. If we look at this set of newspaper articles for 1890, there's about 200 various sources there. Most of them are about the Danforth Creek murder. Yeah, it was a big news year. But there was plenty else going on. The problem is how I want to present it. Do I present it side by side in columns, one column for the diary, one column for the information? Do I present it on a double page spread with one page for the diary, one page for the newspaper article information? Or do I punctuate the diary text with events from the day? I don't know. Maybe you've got some ideas. I'd love to hear them, because the information is out there. I just don't know how to go with it. Now, it's about time I actually showed you some sections from the diary, and of course you can all read that straight away, can't you? Yeah. Everyone loves 19th century writing. All of these are from the colonial years, and all of these are ones that I've transcribed. And the first one, which you can see here, shows the Hamilton's trip from Woombye to Downfall Creek. As I said, after the first child was born, and after he improved his land in Woombye, he was straight back down. So, March 19th. And I'm starting from where it said light shower started. So light shower started from Uncle's place for Downfall Creek, 8:30 a.m. Roads terrible bad. Had dinner on roadside near Malula, got to Mellon Creek about 5 p.m, put up there for the night. He wasn't a big fan of punctuation, by the way. March 20th, showery, started on our journey 9 a.m, arrived at Gregor's 12 noon, had dinner there, arrived Mr. East's Hotel Parbu there, 5:15 p.m, put up for the night, met Evangelist Graham. March 21st, dry, left Caboolture about 9 a.m, got to Pine River 12 noon, River 2 Heights cross, camped 2 hours and had dinner, arrived at Father's Place, Downfall Creek, 4:30 p.m. That took 56 hours to travel from Woombye to Chermside. So one day, I thought, that's way too long. I wonder what Google Maps has got to say about that. 1 hour. Even if you take public transport on a Sunday, it's 2 hours 25. You don't know how good you've got it. Second excerpt comes from 27th of December 1890. Very sentimental excerpt here. Thunderstorm in afternoon, I painted kitchen. Our first son was born about 9 p.m. Mrs. Horsburgh attended MJ. Mother and Charlotte were with her also. Painting. Child born. Told you it wasn't very sentimental. Apart from one example, and Bev knows exactly the one I'm going to talk about, when his son came home from the First World War. That was the only sentimental bit in the whole diary. Third excerpt comes from a few days later. December 29th, Hamilton mentions H. Newitt got married to Miss England. The next day he writes, H. Newitt commenced work. Good for him. 1890's diary led a bit through to 1891. So on January 1st, he noted another wedding. Thomas Dunn got married to Miss Johnston. This was followed up the next day with T. Dunn did not turn up to work. I wonder why. You can sense the disapproval dripping from Thomas Hamilton's pen. He was staunchly religious and he was not a fan of this. And so, as I said at the beginning, a lot of you have family who have been in Chermside for a long time. And you probably think your family is very important in Chermside. And you're right. But the thing that sets Thomas Hamilton apart wasn't the page-long list of all the things he did, but it was that he wrote about it in excruciating detail. And thanks to him, all of us today are able to know exactly what Chermside was like in the 1890s to 1950s. Even if I haven't won you over, I hope that at least it's given you pause for thought. Thanks very much.